Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session of Engaging Diverse Audience as part of the Data Eco Culture. My name is Carl-Edwin Michel. I'm going to be your host for this session, and I hope we're going to have a great session. We have great panelists with us today, so it should be a lot of fun. But before we start, I would like to, although we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. So from coast to coast to coast in Canada, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all First Nation people that call this land home. We acknowledge these people and the lands to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and our own understanding of local Indigenous people and their cultures. Please join me to acknowledge the value, perspectives, and language and the culture which can guide and inspire us. The role of Indigenous people as guardian and steward of the lands, and to consider how we are and can each, in our own way, try to move forward in spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So today, we are going to talk about engaging diverse audience using data to ensure that all voices are heard and their needs are met. Before we start, I would invite you to join the conversation also on social media by using Data Ecoculture, the hashtag Data Ecoculture, just to continue the conversation on social media. If you need transcribers or translation, please select your language, French or English, by clicking on the option on the top of the video screen. You'll be able to choose your language there and follow in your preferred language. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a description of how we're going to do this today for this session. It's going to be kind of like three dynamic session. So the first one is going to be a roundtable, then we'll have a discussion, and obviously a Q&A. I invite you to ask your questions throughout the session, and I'll take those questions if they pertain specifically with what the panelists are talking. I'll ask them directly, and then some of them will be left for the end of the session for the Q&A session. So with that being said, we'd love to introduce our contributors for today. So Joan Jenkinson, CEO of Black Screen Office. Joan is the inaugural executive director of the Black Screen Office, which support, nurture, and promote the creation of Black Canadian stories globally. Hi, Joan.
Hi, thank you. Nice to be here.
That's great. And we also have Erin Smith, Manager Research and Strategic Planning for Ontario Creates. Erin is a strategic planning and policy leader and currently manage research and strategic planning at Ontario Creates. Hello, Erin.
Hello.
And finally, we have Richard Koo. Richard is the Senior Manager Media Analytics for Canada Media Fund and Telefilm. Richard is the head of the TV and Digital Measurement Initiative at the CMF and also co-managed the CMF annual calculation of over $350 million in production and development financing. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Carl-Edwin. Nice to be here.
Great. All right, so we're going to start with our first part of the discussion. So we're going to talk about ensuring inclusivity in consumer audience data collection. So my question to all of you, and we'll start with Richard, what can we do to better understand consumption pattern in underrepresented communities? Why is this important? And how has the advent of additional platform choices like, nonlinear, like streaming, provide us the opportunity to rethink this? Richard.
Thanks, Carl-Edwin. Big question. And I think at the CMF, one of the things that we've really come to understand and has been a real reckoning over the last number of years is that there is a huge gap in data collection between what is actually being consumed and our ability to measure that. And that has huge implications for everyone involved. Broadcasters, producers, policymakers. Certainly from our perspective, these gaps make it very, very difficult for us to be able to address issues of including underrepresentation without adequate data. I want to sort of highlight two important aspects of this. One, of course, is the new emerging, very important nonlinear services, OTT services, which now make up, of course, 30% of content consumption in the marketplace. There is no real public understanding or knowledge of how content is being consumed, because a lot of these services keep their data private. So one of the things that would be really nice to have, obviously, is some levels of public disclosure to understand who's watching the content on these platforms and what they're consuming. But these services also have a great opportunity, because of the nature of the data which they collect and how they're able to do it through streaming and over-the-top direct to the peer-to-peer services, to really start evolving the way measurement occurs, to perhaps measure not just your standard age, person demographics, but also individual communities and racialized persons. And that brings me, I guess, to my second point, which is the linear measurement service, which is still representing 70% of content consumption in the marketplace. Linear television used to be, of course, the standard, the only way you would be able to consume content for decades. And the rating system, the measurement systems, have been the standard used to understand how people consume on this sort of singular platform. Those systems have been in place for decades also, and they've been rooted, I guess, in a tradition of using panel measurement to identify trends and aggregate audiences in these consumption areas. The problem with the panels is that the panels are great for, again, aggregate and understanding of audiences and general trending, but they're only weighted in what I might suggest are, I guess, traditional methods of market research. They're generally weighted on age, sex, region, market, language of market, so English or French. And those are the only real ways that the panel, which represents in Canada about 5,000 households, is understanding of the consumption. The problem with this, of course, is that Canada itself is more than just a fabric of people based on these types of categorizations. There are any number of underrepresented or racialized communities that also make up the fabric of Canadian society, and we're not getting a good understanding of their consumption patterns because we just don't have a way of measuring them in these panels. Now, when you think about it, 22%, over 22% of Canadians identify themselves as racialized. That's close to the population of Quebec, for example, and there's no real addressing or accounting for these persons in the panels. Sure, they are present in the panels, but there's no waiting for their consumption. So the thing to think about is how can we get a better understanding of these contours of the market, which is not just an age, sex, language, demographic, but also that of communities. And that's what we really want to start to be able to bridge those gaps. And I think it's important for us to be able to create a measurement system that will start addressing those.
Thank you, Richard. And I would like to go to Joan to answer that question and chime in more on this subject.
Well, I think Richard teed up exactly what I wanted to lead into speaking about, because as he said, there are currently no methods at all in TV measurement that capture anything beyond the basic demographics, and certainly not by racial characteristics. And so we have no data at all on Black, Indigenous, people of color consume, how they consume media, and how consumers perceive their stories. So we believe that this has contributed to the actual lack of content that we see on our screens. But this is something we want to go out and prove. And given, this time of, racial reckoning and Canada realizing that the screen-based medias are, kind of rife with systemic racism, the Black Screen Office wants to help advance that movement, and we believe that we do that by starting out with getting data. So, as Richard said, this doesn't exist. So what we want to do is to create a study on the national race-based audience data and shed light on what the screen media preferences and habits are of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And we want to get an understanding of who they are as an audience, what they're consuming, on which platforms they're consuming it, and a number of factors related to consumptions. But one of the key things that we really want to know is, and what we want to address is, the value of those communities seeing themselves in their stories and on the screens. So this is a priority for us. We need to know who's out there watching, because in addition to 22 or 23% of the population being Black, Indigenous, people of color, up to 50% or more in some of the major cities are comprised of those communities. So there's a lot of information that we just don't have, and we're not using in the ecosystem of making screen-based content.
That's great. Well, thanks for that answer. And Erin, would you respond to that question?
I mean, certainly I would say as a researcher, the robust data set that sort of an over-the-top Netflix player might possess is just like astounding, right? Because you can know, who is watching, when they are watching, what they are watching, and you can know theoretically who in each household is watching. So the sort of the level of analytics that could potentially be available is really exciting, and it's unfortunate the way that some of that information, intellectual property, belongs to those corporations and isn't being freely shared. Ontario Creates has a mandate for economic development. So when we look at our sort of measures and what we measure, it's traditionally and historically been kind of how much money is a project going to spend in Ontario, how many jobs is it going to create. We have always been a little less interested in who's watching it on the other end. But I think sort of that approach to economic development has certainly tended to benefit those companies that have been making content the longest. So we've sort of over the last couple of years been sort of reconceptualizing what economic development means to find ways to make it more inclusive and equitable. So one of the ways we approach kind of, I guess, the lack of robust data about audience measurement is through our research program. So we know that there are studies that show that content that is created by diverse teams and has a diverse cast, for instance, earns more revenues and has greater audiences. So, those are things that we think about when we are assessing applications. And then also we worked last year on some internal research. We partnered with Vice, and they did a survey of 1,000 Ontarians, 500 in Gen Z and 500 in Gen Y. And one of the things they asked them was about their desire for original Canadian content. And we found in that study that 75% of those respondents in Gen Z were really interested and motivated to watch original content that told stories about the sort of communities they saw around them, and that they also strongly identified the content that they have available to them as not being reflective of the communities they see. So more than half of them identified that they're actively looking for content that reflects their experiences and they're not finding it. So we use that kind of data to drive a greater emphasis in our assessment on projects that have elements, diverse cast, diverse teams, that sort of thing.
That's great. Thanks for that. And you're mentioning some tools, and maybe I will go back to Richard on that. Is there specific tools or ways that you guys are using now to calculate those audiences, or is it still something that needs to be done?
That's a challenge for us. We're beholden to, I guess, the measurements that we're able to acquire from the measurement systems. We are using more and more a variety of different tools to try and fill some of those gaps. I mean, obviously, Numeris is the standard for linear consumption, so we have that to get aggregate audiences. In terms of some of the OTT services, we've been using paired analytics as a method to understand how content is performing on those services. They have some functionality, I understand, in terms of being able to identify diverse audiences, the communities that are consuming content. So that's information that we're trying to work with and understand. So, and I know there are another number of other companies in the marketplace that are creating panels that have specific references to underserved and underrepresented communities to understand on an ongoing basis how they consume content, on what platforms they consume it on, what types of programs, not necessarily on a sort of 24/7 panel level like Numeris, but still in a manner that does provide us more information. So from the CMF perspective, we're trying to piece together data from different sources to get a better, more full picture as to what consumption really looks like in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. And on your side, is there any tools or any strategy that you guys can use to be able to paint a better picture?
So we're just at the beginning of this journey. Our organization is just a little over 4 months old, and we have 3 research studies on the way. So we are depending on advice from people like Richard at the CMF and others at Telefilm to help guide us through the process. But to begin with, we are going to be using the most reputable companies that we can find who have a lot of experience in this area, whom we hope to learn from. We're also getting, because our sources of funding for these projects are coming from multiple places, including broadcasters, advertisers, and funders, we're getting their perspective on before we even send out our request for proposals on what they would like to see included in those proposals and what they would like to see those companies deliver. So we're learning a lot through that process as well. In some ways, it's great to be at the beginning because you can learn from either successes or failures from other organizations, and I feel really privileged to be at the beginning because we're just starting from the ground zero. There's no information on the Black community. So, and if it is, it's very program specific with broadcasters or streamers. It's not information that is widely known and collected. So in these number of studies that we're doing, I think we're doing some of the things that are the first of its kind in terms of being broad in scope.
That's interesting. And Erin, you touched a little bit on it, but what kind of tools that Ontario creates or strategy you would use to, further get more information on these communities?
So because we don't use sort of audience consumption metrics in, our assessment of the projects that we would want to fund, we tend to use, more things like our own internal research or third-party research that would help us sort of bolster our understanding of how diversity and race are economic development issues, and then use that to incorporate into our project assessment factors. More of that type of thing than like a data tool necessarily.
Thanks for that. That's great. I would like to go to our second portion or more question, and it's more about ensuring inclusivity in content creators data collection. And my question to you is, what can we do to better understand representation of creators in the industry? How can we approach this to ensure inclusivity and buy-in from underrepresented groups that we are trying to reach? And I'll start with you, Joan, on this one.
So as I've said, we're focused at the Black Screen Office largely on the Black community, although we are doing some of our studies with Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We are doing or are proposing to do a new study that is a national labor market study on Black Canadians working throughout the screen industries. Again, there's very little data on who the producers, writers, and directors, tech crew are, what their participation is in the screen business. And so in order to achieve greater inclusion, we actually need to know who they are. So this study is looking at who they are, where they are, what their education level is, their professional experience, the career paths they've taken, the barriers that they face, what supports have been helpful, and really ultimately, how are we going to keep them in Canada? Because once people are integrated and finally have some opportunities in the Canadian market, I think it's going to be too small to contain them. And we will need to become more global in our thinking when it comes to our content creators and how we're going to get content from them, where they're going to be exhibiting that content moving forward. But again, I'm thrilled about the idea of being able to go across the country to find out, where everyone is. Just anecdotally, I spoke on a panel in Manitoba. Well, I wasn't in Manitoba, but virtually in Manitoba. And afterwards, I had 6 Black producers reach out to me and say, "Oh my God, there you are." I'm so glad that you guys exist, because they just felt so isolated in I guess in Winnipeg, where there are so few, but across the country, collectively, there could be a sizable community that could really help each other as they're growing in the industry.
Great. And Richard, yeah?
Well, I mean, in terms of trying to collect data for content creators, I think we know instinctively that this industry, this business is not a true representation of racialized and underrepresented communities in terms of creators, in terms of people that are working in business, just the levels of people that are employed. That being said, we have not been very good historically in collecting any of this type of data. So we're kind of flying blind here in order to be able to empirically define, what that gap is between general population and the number of people in our business that are representing racialized and underrepresented communities. So from our perspective, I mean, this is a big problem in terms of developing policy, because unless you know where you need to get to, you're never going to be able to create mechanisms or policies to bridge those gaps. So from our perspective, we have to bring to base level. How do you start collecting this data? And it's more challenging than you think for a number of reasons. And the biggest thing is that in order to be able to collect this data, you have to create an infrastructure that people identify with and trust. And the key to this is all in self-identification. Having those that are identifying as a racialized or person to come forward and identify what group they belong to, they identify with. Without buy-in from the communities as to the definitions that we're using, we're less likely to be able to get robust sets of data. Historically, racialized data has been used in a negative sense. And so that's one of the reasons why we need to ensure that the communities that we want to assist are being consulted when we create these data sets and these infrastructures in order to understand the makeup of our industry. Secondly, there's there's standardization of definitions that is necessary across the industry to be able to understand how successful racialized people have been in terms of getting to where we want them to be in the business. That being said, the definitions are always evolving and always changing, and we have multiple agencies that are involved in trying to collect this information. So how do you create a system that works, that is not onerous, that can take data and essentially port them across different aspects of our business to understand where we're going. One of the ways at the CMF that we've tried to do this is by hosting a number of working groups on defining terminologies that can be used to describe racialized persons and underrepresented persons. And by doing that, we're first of all consulting with these communities to make sure that the definitions we come up with are accepted and that people will actually respond in a way that makes the data robust. We've also partnered with Ipsos in one of our COVID relief funds back last year that was directed to Black and persons of colors. Those relief funds were also attached to a questionnaire where we asked them if what terms were most they most identified with in terms of their own racial background, and we use that information to help inform these working groups. So I think in the end, what we're hoping to do is have an industry consensus in terms of how we go forward with data collection in a manner that is as user-friendly and as robust as possible. So.
That's great. And Erin, how do you see the buy-in from these communities? How do you
I mean, I think we have many of the same challenges as the CMF, and I think one of those challenges too is the need for people to self-identify and the mechanism by which they do that. So for us, across all of our programs and sectors, so we support film and TV, but also book publishing, magazine, interactive digital media, and music. The person filling out the application, may even be an administrative assistant at the company. And so what is the infrastructure that we need to have in place for that system to then be able to notify, the people that we've determined are key roles on a project to then sort of like actively enter our system and provide demographic information to us. So there's a lot of sort of, I think, consultation that we still need to do in order to familiarize that process with people and get the buy-in that's necessary to provide that kind of voluntary demographic information to a government institution. And so, I mean, this is a kind of a project that we've been working on for maybe half a decade at this point, and it started out and continues to be something that we support through our research program. So we will fund industry trade organizations to go out and do their own research studies to look at sort of what underrepresented communities look like, what the barriers are to participation in an industry, that sort of thing. So that's sort of one line of data collection we have. And then the other piece is this sort of big project we're in the middle of to collect demographic data from our applicants. And we did an internal research project maybe 3 years ago where we looked back at 3 years of funding we'd given out, and we looked at sort of the gender breakdown in key roles. So part of that was just because it was sort of easier to find a methodology to assess gender in projects that we'd already funded. And in doing that, we kind of created a key role matrix. So we looked across business lines and across sort of creative roles to look at, okay, in terms of, creating a product, what are the creative roles that are most important into how that product turns out? What are the business roles? So these are the kind of roles that we want to collect demographic data on in the future. So now we're sort of expanding that piece of work and building it out so that we have the ability to know who we want to ask those questions of and kind of build that into our infrastructure.
That's great. And you mentioned digital media. I am from the video game industry. Have you seen some challenges on that side too? I mean, I would like to think that there's some challenges also on that side of the business, but maybe you can tell us more on that side.
In terms of So an interesting sort of challenge we've come up with the IDM industry. An industry like film and television has very standardized role definitions. So, a line producer on a documentary, does more or less the same thing as a line producer on a feature film. But roles and titles aren't quite as standardized in the interactive digital media community. So we've come up, where film and TV, there might be 15 titles that we would consider key roles. For IDM, there's maybe 60 of them. So in terms of knowing how to ask demographic, like who is a key role in this project, is a lot trickier. So we're having to do a lot of work right now figuring out, okay, you're a character animator, what does that mean in the context of this project? Is that role transfer, like will another IDM company understand kind of generally what that role is and what they do, and will they have the sort of same importance on a project? So how can we sort of like ask those questions and figure out who we need to ask demographic questions of in terms of their importance in the role of a project? So that's been a challenge for us. And then I think also understanding sort of how underrepresented groups change from sector to sector. So not all sectors have sort of the same type of marginalization of communities. So that's sort of an interesting piece where IDM would be slightly different than film and television, for instance.
I'll have a question to Richard and Joan at the same time. Do you guys touch digital media? And before you answer, I invite people to start asking their question in the chat, so we can ask them to the panelists.
I can go. Sure. It definitely. I mean, the CMF is structured that we in a way that we finance both traditional long form content and digital content, digital media content, and the same challenges apply in both sectors in terms of our understanding of underrepresented and racialized communities is basically that we haven't collected the data in a particularly robust way in the past, and now that there's an understanding in society that this is an important social justice issue for equity, that we have to start collecting it in a way that makes sense. But we are starting from a foundational point in order to make sure that we get the self-identification that is necessary for these data sets to really be robust. So the same issues transcend both television and digital content for sure.
We'll be exploring in our market intelligence survey among Black Canadians throughout the screen industry, all screen industries. Right now, we don't have any data, but that will certainly be one of the elements that we want to capture.
Perfect. I want to go to questions, and I have a question here from Caitlin. Can you talk about what can be done to engage with an invite audience that have been excluded from culture events, or those who don't think these culture events are for them? And then, for example, they may have been excluded by a lack of accessibility, by negative attitude, lack of representation, systemic discrimination, financial blocks, or simply by being left out of the conversation or marketing targeting. So I don't know who wants to answer that question first, but that's an interesting one. Yeah, Erin.
I can answer part of it. We're working with WIFT Alberta on a really interesting study that looks at the role of networking in building careers in the screen industry, and it's specifically looking at whether sort of homogenous industry events are have a negative impact on sort of the role of racialized individuals in participating in those events. So if a racialized person shows up at an event and it's 100 white people and they're the only person of their race, that I think is turning out to be sort of incredibly dissuasive in terms of them feeling comfortable at the event, them being able to network at the event. So in terms of our organization, we do a lot of business development and networking events. So ways that we can take that research and implement it is, to make sure that our guest lists are balanced, that we have people from all sorts of diverse communities so that people see themselves reflected there, see people that are that look like them, that have things in common with them, and then see people sort of to the extent possible at all different levels, so that so it doesn't seem like quite as alien or hostile environment. So there's some sort of really practical things that we can implement as an organization that does some of that kind of business development networking work.
Joan?
I'm just saying this is such a very, very new thing. I've been in the industry for a very long time and have been the only Black person in the rooms for, when, 800 people and you're the only one. It is a hostile environment. It seems like we're, an open, on the surface inclusive industry, but it really is not. It's very daunting for people of color and Black and Indigenous people to be in those settings. So it's certainly a welcome change that organizations are making that effort. And one of the things that we are doing at the Black Screen office is to really create a sense of a safe space for the Black community and a place that is unifying to the community, where we can provide access to a lot of these services and opportunities that there are in the industry that have been barriers, and not only access nationally but internationally, to really expand our network beyond borders.
And Carl-Edwin, I think I might just add, in terms of from a data collection perspective, and as I said earlier, we know instinctively that there is a huge gap between representation and what is actually occurring in our business. And we can also show through the data, though, that there's a huge demand for stories that speak to communities and bringing creators that represent those stories into the business. I think once we can truly robustly show that demand through the data systems that we're trying to develop at this stage, we can make at the very least, a business case to say that, this is important. This is a market that we need to be doing better at. And then it behooves all of us in the business to make much more of an effort in order to be inclusive, right? The data will back up the efforts that we do, but we have to be going out there and in good faith welcoming people. It's like any other issue with equity in any environment. You can't just simply say we're open and then expect people to come. You have to make them feel welcome. So it really is us, as those that are already in the business, those of us that have those positions of power, to reach out and welcome actively and incorporate them into this business here. So.
Yeah, so there's an effort to be done, basically what you're saying. And how long do you think it will take for us to get that data? How many years of research or data collection to be able to make those proper decisions and drive this in the right direction? Maybe Joan, if you would like to.
Again, being at the beginning stages of doing these studies, I'm just shocked at how long it's going to take, even just to get one research project done. It's a year at best, and I'm impatient. I'm like, I can't wait a year.
You need it now.
This information, I need to know it now. So I find that incredibly frustrating and challenging, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's going to be really important for us to be open with the data that we are gathering, so that we can all benefit in the interim as this information is rolling out.
And I think that's important what you said. And before you answer, Richard, sharing that data between organizations is going to be also important. Make it open and available, because otherwise we're all in our own silos doing multiple research.
I have to say, one of the things I found really interesting, and I don't know how you can find it interesting, but it was Richard's group on the racial identities working group. I thought it was endlessly fascinating, also because there are so many different groups coming together to talk about this, and it all of a sudden became very exciting. And I'm excited about getting that information out so that we, as quickly as possible, can be all on the same page about, who we're talking about and who we're collecting data on to make it as consistent and as useful as possible across the board.
And just to continue on Joan's thought, thanks, Joan, for that. I think but the creation of that working group was important to bring all stakeholders together, because we all touch different aspects of the business, right? And there's not one group that does everything. So you're looking at different agencies collecting different sets of data, which the end, if you can't make some sort of collaborative sense of it, will not get us to where we need to be in terms of understanding the makeup of representation. So that was why it was important, we felt, to be part of this. Also to understand the different perspectives people are coming from, and try to come up with sort of common language that we could all agree is a basis for collecting data. And the CMF is going to be releasing in the coming weeks the findings of that working group as a discussion paper to start encouraging agencies, companies to look at collecting data and defining and persons from racialized communities in this manner. It's going to continue to evolve, but it's a starting point, right? And to your question on how long this is going to take, I agree with Joan. I'm impatient as well. I don't want to put a timeline on it. I mean, we've done our best to go back into our limited amounts of data to try and baseline things. But I think right now, the key for us is to start with baselining where we currently sit, and then trend it over the next year, 2, 3 years to see the progress that we've made. And I think those are going to be the first key elements of understanding how successful we've been and how much more further we have to go.
So another bit of challenge is the intersectionality question, because it's not simple. And I don't mean intersectionality as in people are multiple identities in terms of racial categorizations. I mean where I've seen over the years the work that's been done in gender equity, how it's left out Black women and women of color and Indigenous women. Gender equity meant equity for white women, and we have to be sure moving forward that everybody moves forward. When you're talking about women, that you mean all women, and even just until recently, I've seen studies where that hasn't been taken into consideration.
And when we talk about underrepresented communities, we've focused a lot on racialized persons in this discussion, but Joan is absolutely correct in terms of intersectionality, and that's sort of our next steps, looking at gender identification, looking at persons with disabilities, looking at potentially a language minority groups to understand their presence in the industry and gaps that they have in terms of their own representation and how we can improve and support them. So there are many, many aspects of this that we're looking at.
Thank you for that. I have something with a question mostly related to technology and the way things are going. And we talk a lot about privacy and protecting our personal data. Do you see that as a deterrent to what you guys are trying to accomplish? Do you see that people will be reluctant to share those information, or not at all?
I mean, for the kind of data that we're collecting is again very baseline. The only intention is to build a better screen-based industry. It's not something that we're going to monetize in any way. The only capital for us will be that it will move the industry forward when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But for sure, privacy is like a massive issue, and it's an issue when it comes to is your data open source or is it closed, and who's going to use it, what is it going to be used for. Those are things that legislatively I think we need to be really on top of, because abuses can happen so easily and so innocuously.
I mean, I would agree that trust is a huge part of this, particularly as a government agency, particularly from governments that have often misused demographic data against the communities that are identifying. For us, also, the need to comply with Privacy Act and legislation adds some complexity to the way that we collect and store data, which adds to the timelines for rolling out data collection for us, because we need to build systems that are secure. So no one assessing an application can ever see the demographic data of an individual attached to that application. So we need to have, quite sophisticated IT infrastructure to back up that collection. So our efforts to date have been, we've added some sort of company demographic questions to surveys that we've sent out, so we can grab a little bit of baseline data, so we're not starting with nothing. But ideally, we're hoping to spend this year building that infrastructure out and sort of working on that trust piece with the creative industry community. And then we're hoping next fiscal year we'll begin to collect that data. And then also, we're sitting on that group that Richard was speaking about. But it would be great to get to a place in the future where there was one secure, trusted source or repository for all of that demographic data, so that individual people didn't need to provide that data to 10 different government organizations or private organizations in order to apply for funding for the same project. So anything we can do collaboratively to create a system that's easy and trusted for creators to use, the better. So that would be great. I mean, I can't imagine that would be happening anytime soon, but it does feel like we're sort of working towards a kind of more collaborative solution to this that would be in everyone's best interests.
Yeah, and I fully agree with what Erin has said and what Joan said earlier as well. And bringing it back to that that first point that I mentioned in terms of getting the trust of the community. This is why when we started defining terms to describe racialized communities, we went to the communities themselves and asked for their input. Because, as Erin mentioned previously, data has been used and misused by governments in the past, and there is an inherent mistrust because of those situations and those occurrences. So we really need to bring them into these discussions. We really need to consult and understand the way they identify themselves in order for this data to be valuable and useful. And that's really where it all begins. It's where it all starts.
Perfect. Well, thanks a lot for your insight for this subject. Really important subject, and I'm glad that we had you, Erin, Joan, Richard, to talk about this. I don't have more questions for you, and we're getting really close to the end of this session. So I think I will close it here. Again, thank you for your time, and I hope it was really insightful. It was insightful to me, so I hope it was insightful also for the audience. Before we go, I just want to let the audience know that you can enjoy the rest of the event. Feel free to join other sessions, network with other participants, or book a meeting with one of our experts in the solution bar. So the next conference is going to be the closing panel of the day. It will be Days Keys Learning plus Gertorp, artist presented by Data Eco Culture. So with that, thank you for your time, and have a great afternoon. My name is Carl-Edwin Michel. See you next time.